The ship was left abandoned for 117 years, until a human mechanic restarted it. Rusty cranes stood frozen like silent sentinels, their long arms reaching into the gray sky. The water was dark, almost black, and it lapped lazily against wooden piers that had begun to crumble. At the edge of this forgotten place lay a ship that no one visited anymore, except for seagulls and the occasional curious stray cat. It was enormous, taller than most buildings along the river, with a hull of iron that had once gleamed under the sunlight. Now it was brown and scarred, coated in rust and covered with barnacles that had claimed it as their own. The ship had a name, though few remembered it. It had been a proud vessel once, built in the early 1900s during a time when steamships were the heart of global trade. She had carried coal, supplies, and people across oceans, connecting distant countries and making promises of adventure and fortune. But that was more than a century ago. The ship's engines had broken down only a few years after she was launched, and repairs were too costly. The decision was made. She would remain docked forever. People who once worked on her retired or passed away, and gradually the ship faded from memory. Over the decades, the world changed around her. The harbor itself had been rebuilt, modernized in places, abandoned in others. Some parts had new warehouses and busy loading docks, but the area where the ship rested was untouched. Children who grew up nearby learned to avoid it, as if they could feel the emptiness around her. Workers from the surrounding industries sometimes told stories about a ghost ship, warning new employees not to go too close. The ship became part of local legend, a relic that everyone had seen but no one had touched. Time had not been kind to the vessel. Her once bright smokestacks were chipped and blackened, and thick vines now crawled over parts of the deck. Paint that had protected the metal for decades peeled off in long strips, flapping in the wind. The windows on the bridge were broken, some entirely missing, while the ones left behind were cloudy with grime. The deckboards creaked under the slightest weight, and the smell of wet wood mixed with rust filled the air. Nature had started to claim her. Birds nested in the smokestacks, while small plants grew in the cracks along the deck. Even the water seemed to cling to her, wrapping around her hull like a slow-moving tide of time. Despite the decay, the ship still had an air of power. Anyone who stood near her could imagine her moving through the open sea, engines roaring, cutting through waves with confidence. Her story had not ended, it had paused. Photographs in old maritime records showed her in her prime, with clean decks, black hull polished to perfection, and steam pouring from her funnels. Officers and sailors posed proudly for the camera, wearing crisp uniforms and hats tilted at exact angles. It was hard to imagine that the same ship now sat motionless, silent, and forgotten. The locals who lived near the harbor would sometimes walk along the water's edge and stop to look at her. Older residents told stories of when the ship was alive, carrying goods and passengers. They remembered the sound of the engines from far away, a low hum that made the docks vibrate. People spoke of the smell of coal burning, the hiss of steam, and the sight of smoke curling into the morning sky. Young people, meanwhile, were fascinated by her appearance, taking photographs from a safe distance and sharing them on social media. The ship had become a symbol, a reminder of a world that had once been busy and alive, now slowed to a permanent pause. Many had suggested dismantling the ship, taking her apart for scrap metal. But each time the cost of removal was too high, and the city could never agree on what to do. Preservationists argued that she was a piece of history, a link to an industrial era that had shaped their city. They wanted her saved, repaired, and even displayed for the public. Others said she was a hazard, decaying too much to ever be safe. The debate lasted for years, yet no action was ever taken. And so the ship remained, anchored in place, untouched, a ghost of the past. Visiting the ship in person was an experience like no other. Walking along the harbor toward her, one could feel the silence press down. The usual sounds of the city, cars, voices, engines, faded the closer one got. The air smelled faintly of salt, rust, and wet wood, carrying with it the memory of the sea. When standing on the shore, looking at her towering presence, it was hard not to feel small, as if the ship had grown into something larger than life while waiting quietly for someone to notice her again. Inside, the ship was even more haunting. The main hall, which had once welcomed passengers with polished wood and brass fittings, was now dark and dusty. Sunlight filtered in through broken portholes, casting sharp lines across floors covered in dirt and debris. Rusted ladders led to decks above, while forgotten ropes and chains hung from walls, swinging slightly with the wind. The sound of water dripping echoed throughout, creating a rhythm that matched the slow pulse of time. It was easy to imagine sailors moving through these halls long ago, giving orders, laughing, or quietly resting. Despite all the damage, parts of the ship remained remarkably intact. The engine room, though coated in rust and dust, still held the massive steel machinery that had once powered her across oceans. Thick pistons, gears, and boilers loomed like silent giants. Some valves and dials were still in place, their markings faded but legible. These mechanical bones of the ship hinted at the incredible craftsmanship of the early 20th century. It was a reminder that even though time had passed, human ingenuity had left a mark that could not easily be erased. Over the years, people who came to see the ship often left quietly, overwhelmed by the mixture of sadness and awe. They would stand on the piers, cameras in hand, capturing images of a structure both beautiful and tragic. The ship had a story to tell, one of ambition, failure, and endurance. Every dent, rust patch, and broken window was a chapter of that story, a testament to a life once lived fully, now paused. For some, it was a lesson about change and impermanence. For others, it was an inspiration, a challenge to imagine what could still be done. Children, too, were drawn to the ship, though they were warned not to climb on her. They would peer through holes in the hull, whispering about ghosts and adventures. In their minds, the ship became a vessel of imagination, a pirate ship, or a secret hideout. Adults, however, saw her differently. They saw history, opportunity, and a kind of quiet dignity. Few could resist the pull of curiosity that the ship demanded. Something about her presence made people slow down, look closer, and think beyond their daily lives. The ship's silence was not total, though. On windy days, her empty metal plates would creak and moan, producing sounds like low sighs or distant voices. Rain dripping through broken sections of the roof would create a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. And when fog rolled in from the river, the ship seemed to float in the mist, further blurring the line between memory and reality. Walking near her at such times felt like stepping into another era, where past and present overlapped. Historians occasionally visited, sifting through old records, blueprints, and photographs. They documented every detail they could find, from the ship's launch date to her engine specifications. They spoke of her alongside other famous vessels, placing her in the broader context of maritime history. Though she had never been famous for tragedy or heroics, the ship represented the everyday life of sailors and workers, the quiet work that kept the world moving. In that sense, she was a hero of ordinary people, a monument to labor, skill, and resilience. Despite all the stories, debates, and research, the ship remained untouched physically. She waited. She waited for someone who could see her not just as metal and wood, but as something that could live again, even if only for a moment. She waited for a hand willing to turn the rusted valves, oil the stiff gears, and listen to the silence long enough to understand her heartbeat. And so, the ship remained in the harbor, a silent witness to 117 years of history. She had seen the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of her city, and the endless cycle of human activity along the river. She was forgotten, yet impossible to ignore. The Iron Widow, they called her, a fitting name for a vessel abandoned by the world but not by time itself. Every layer of rust, every broken window, and every creaking plank was a reminder that the past was still here, waiting for someone to notice, to respect, and perhaps to bring her back to life. Ewan McLeary had always loved machines. As a child, he would sit for hours in his grandfather's workshop, watching the old man tighten bolts, polish metal, and repair engines that had not worked in decades. He was small for his age, with a shock of dark hair that never stayed in place and hands that were always smeared with grease. But he had patience, a rare kind of patience that let him see what others could not. Where some saw broken parts, he saw potential. Where others saw rust, he saw strength. Ewan grew up near the river, not far from the abandoned harbor. He had walked past the old ship countless times, always curious but never brave enough to get close. The stories his neighbors told about the Iron Widow had filled him with wonder. A ship that had not moved in over 100 years. A ship that had survived wars, storms, and neglect. For Ewan, it was like discovering a puzzle waiting to be solved. As he grew older, Ewan became a mechanic, working in small workshops repairing diesel engines, boats, and old machinery. He was skilled, but jobs were scarce, and his hours were long. Many of his colleagues left for better-paying positions in the city, but Ewan stayed. He had always felt a connection to machines, as if they spoke a language only he could understand. They had stories to tell, and he wanted to hear them all. One gray afternoon, after being laid off from a marine repair company due to budget cuts, Ewan wandered toward the old harbor. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a cold wind carried the smell of wet metal and river water. He had nothing to do, nowhere to go, and yet he felt drawn to the ship. It stood there as it had for decades, silent and imposing. For a moment, Ewan just watched, taking in the details, the rust patterns along the hull, the missing sections of railing, the barnacles clinging stubbornly to her sides. It was as if she were waiting for him. Ewan had no plan when he first approached the ship. He didn't know if it was legal to go there or even if it was safe. But curiosity and something deeper, an almost magical pull, led him to climb onto the dock. He carried only a small toolbox and a flashlight. The rest, he thought, would come naturally. Stepping aboard the deck was like entering another world. The boards creaked under his weight, and dust rose into the air, swirling in the beam of his flashlight. Sunlight peeked through broken portholes, creating patterns on the floor. The smell was strong: rust, mold, old wood, and a faint trace of coal smoke from over a century ago. Ewan took a deep breath. For him, this was not unpleasant. It was alive. The ship had a presence, a heartbeat that could still be felt if one listened carefully. He explored cautiously, moving from the deck to the cabins and finally down to the engine room. His eyes widened as he saw the machinery. Massive pistons, thick steel gears, and an old boiler that had not seen fire in more than 100 years. Everything was covered in rust and dust, but the structure was solid. Ewan ran his hands along the metal, imagining how it must have felt when it was new. The hum of engines, the warmth of steam, the vibration underfoot as the ship cut through the waves. Ewan was not alone in his fascination. Local historians had visited the ship occasionally, leaving notes, photographs, and blueprints in nearby offices. Ewan spent nights studying these documents, learning how the ship's steam engines worked, the design of the boilers, and the purpose of each valve and piston. He became obsessed, reading everything he could find about early 20th century steam propulsion. Every evening he would sit by the river with a notebook, sketching diagrams and writing down ideas. He knew the task ahead would not be easy. The ship had been abandoned for 117 years. Parts of the engine were likely fused together, rusted, or missing entirely. Boilers could be dangerous if handled incorrectly. Some experts had told him it would be impossible to restart the ship without completely rebuilding it using modern machinery. But Ewan refused to give up. He did not want to replace her. He wanted to awaken her. Months passed. Ewan returned to the harbor daily. He cleaned the deck, removed debris, and reinforced weak sections of the wood. He carefully examined the engine room, oiling gears and loosening valves. He spent hours scraping rust from moving parts, applying solutions to free the metal that had frozen over decades. Neighbors noticed his dedication. Some offered him advice, while others shook their heads, thinking he was chasing an impossible dream. Ewan ignored the doubt. He had patience and determination, and that was enough. Slowly, Ewan began to make small progress. A valve that had not turned in decades started to move. A section of the boiler, once thought sealed shut, opened with careful effort. Every small success felt monumental. He kept detailed logs of his work, sketching each repair and noting every discovery. It was like learning a new language, the language of machines that had been silent for more than a century. Word of his work began to spread. A few retired engineers and local mechanics came to observe, some offering tips, others simply admiring his dedication. They brought tools, oil, and replacement parts from other old ships, contributing what they could. It became a quiet community project, although Ewan never sought attention. He wanted the ship to speak for herself. Ewan's nights were spent planning. He studied old photographs, read engineering manuals from the early 1900s, and compared the ship's design to other famous vessels. He contacted maritime museums, asking for advice on restoring antique machinery. Some experts were skeptical, warning him about safety, legality, and the difficulty of working on a ship that had been abandoned for over a century. But Ewan was relentless. He listened, learned, and adapted. Every warning became a puzzle to solve rather than an obstacle. As winter approached, the work became more challenging. Cold winds blew through the broken windows and snow occasionally dusted the deck. But Ewan was undeterred. He built temporary shelters, wore layers of clothing, and continued working even in harsh weather. Each day, he would inspect the engines, tighten bolts, and apply protective coatings. Slowly, the machinery began to respond. A piston that had not moved in 117 years now shifted slightly when nudged. A wheel that had been frozen now turned a fraction of a rotation. These tiny victories kept him going. There were moments of frustration, too. Sometimes, after hours of work, a section of the engine would refuse to budge. Sometimes, a new problem would appear, a broken pipe, a cracked gear, or a rusted hinge. Ewan would step back, take a deep breath, and figure out a solution. He learned to be patient, to respect the ship and the machines he was working on. Force would not work. Care, understanding, and persistence were the keys. Despite the difficulties, Ewan felt a connection to the ship that grew stronger every day. He spoke to her quietly as he worked, as if encouraging her to awaken. "Just a little more," he would say. "I know you can do this." It might have sounded strange to anyone else, but Ewan believed that machines had memory and that his care could coax her back to life. Slowly, she seemed to respond. Every turn of a valve, every loosened bolt, every cleaned gear brought her closer to movement. As spring arrived, Ewan's work began to show real results. The engine room smelled less of rust and decay and more of oil and warm metal. A small section of the boiler vented steam as he carefully tested it, proof that the machinery was responding to his efforts. It was a delicate process. One misstep could damage the engine permanently. But Ewan had learned to listen, to feel the subtle vibrations and sounds that indicated progress. The city began to take notice. Reporters came to document his work, although Ewan remained humble. He did not want fame, he wanted the ship to live again. Crowdfunding campaigns were set up to support his efforts, bringing in donations from people inspired by his dedication. Some volunteers joined him at the harbor, cleaning decks, documenting work, and assisting with minor repairs. It became a community effort, a shared dream of reviving a piece of history. Despite growing attention, Ewan remained focused. He spent long hours studying every component, sometimes working late into the night with only a flashlight for company. He could hear the wind whistling through the smokestacks, the faint creak of old wood, and the distant calls of seagulls. These sounds reminded him that the ship was still here, waiting, alive in her own way. By the end of the year, Ewan had reached a point where real movement seemed possible. Valves could be turned. Pistons shifted when nudged. Sections of the boiler held pressure. It was not enough to sail, not yet, but it was proof that the ship could respond to care and patience. Ewan knew the hardest part was still ahead, igniting the engines and restarting a vessel that had been silent for 117 years. But he felt ready. He had learned every inch of her structure, studied every component, and gained the trust of those who had once doubted him. More than anything, Ewan had learned to listen. The ship had a voice, subtle and patient, and he had learned how to hear it. Every groan, every creak, every vibration told him something important. She was not just metal and wood, she was history, memory, and potential. And for the first time, it seemed she was ready to respond to the human who had been brave enough to care. After months of patient work, Ewan McLeary finally stood in the engine room, taking a deep breath. Every tool was in place, every valve had been carefully oiled, and every gear had been checked, cleaned, and aligned. The room smelled of warm metal and oil, mixed with the faint scent of coal that seemed to linger from a century ago. Sunlight streamed in through cracks in the deck above, casting a golden glow on the massive machinery. It was quiet except for the occasional drip of water and the soft creak of the ship settling on the piers. Ewan had imagined this moment countless times. In his mind, he had rehearsed every step, every precaution, every sound he might hear when the engines came alive. But standing there in reality was different. The engines were massive, with pistons the size of tree trunks and valves as tall as a man. He could feel the weight of history pressing down, the years of silence and abandonment now finally challenged by a single human hand. His heart beat faster than he expected, not from fear, but from excitement. He started slowly, turning the main valve that controlled steam flow to the primary boiler. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal creaked faintly under his touch, but the engine remained still. He adjusted the pressure gauges, watching carefully for any sign of movement. The pistons did not budge, the gears stayed frozen. For a second, he doubted himself. Could a ship abandoned for 117 years truly be brought back to life? Ewan reminded himself of all the small victories leading up to this moment. Every rusted valve he had freed, every section of boiler he had opened, every tiny rotation of a piston was proof that the ship was not yet dead. Slowly, he opened another valve, releasing steam into the secondary boiler. A faint hiss sounded, sharp and metallic, and then it faded into silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ewan smiled slightly. It was a sound he had never expected to hear outside of old photographs and diagrams. He moved to the control panel, running his hands over the levers, switches, and gauges. Everything looked old, worn, and delicate, but it was remarkably intact. The original builders had crafted these machines to last, and despite decades of neglect, they had survived. He checked every connection, tightened every loose bolt, and tested every emergency mechanism. One small mistake now could damage the engine permanently, and Ewan knew that. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. The first attempt to ignite the main boiler was cautious. Ewan applied a small flame to the fuel source, watching for smoke or movement. Nothing happened. He waited, checking pressure gauges and valves. Still, the engines remained motionless. For a moment, he felt a pang of disappointment, but he quickly reminded himself that machines this old often required patience. The ship had waited 117 years. Surely, a few more minutes would not matter. He repeated the process carefully, adjusting the valves, increasing the steam pressure gradually. The hissing grew louder, the smell of heated metal stronger, and finally he felt the first vibration through the floor. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ewan froze for a moment, listening. The pistons shifted slightly, the gears moved a fraction of a degree. The ship was responding. Encouraged, Ewan applied steam more steadily. The room began to hum, low and powerful. Metal groaned under the pressure, but it was the groan of life, not decay. The pistons started moving rhythmically, the gears turning slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. The boiler hissed and whistled, sending clouds of steam into the room. Ewan wiped sweat from his forehead, smiling despite the heat. This was more than he had imagined. The ship, silent for over a century, was awakening. Outside the engine room, the harbor seemed to notice too. A flock of seagulls rose suddenly from the water, startled by a deep vibration that pulsed through the air. The dock creaked and shuddered slightly as if it too was celebrating the return of life. Ewan could hear the faint echoes bouncing off the water and nearby buildings. It was a sound that had not been heard in 117 years, a low, steady heartbeat of iron and steam. Ewan moved carefully to the main crank, the lever that would fully engage the engine. He placed both hands on it, feeling the cold metal under his fingers. The machinery groaned again, louder this time, as if testing him. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and pushed. The lever moved with resistance at first, then more easily as the pistons synchronized. Steam hissed from the boilers, filling the room with white mist. The engine roared softly, a sound both terrifying and beautiful. Minutes felt like hours as Ewan adjusted the controls. He monitored every gauge, every pressure reading, every vibration. The ship was alive but delicate. He had to guide her carefully, coaxing life from decades of neglect. Slowly, steadily, he increased steam pressure, synchronized the pistons, and watched the gears turn. The hum became a rhythm, the rhythm became a pulse, and the pulse became a roar. Finally, it happened. The engine shuddered, groaned, and then began to move on its own. The pistons rose and fell in perfect rhythm, the gears rotated smoothly, and the boiler vented steam in controlled bursts. Ewan stepped back, letting the machine take over. He could feel the energy of the ship beneath him, the power of years of history flowing through metal that had not moved for generations. The Iron Widow, they had called her. Now the name seemed right. She was no longer abandoned. The harbor was filled with a low, constant vibration. Nearby cranes trembled slightly, water rippled along the piers, and seagulls circled overhead, shrieking in alarm or perhaps celebration. Ewan's heart pounded in his chest. He had done it. Against all odds, he had restarted the engine of a ship that had been silent for 117 years. He could not stop smiling, but he remained cautious. The work was not over. The ship was alive, yes, but she was still fragile. Every movement had to be measured, every pressure carefully monitored. He took a moment to admire the scene. Steam curled from the smokestacks, shimmering in the morning light. The engine room vibrated with power and life. The sound echoed through the empty harbor, bouncing off buildings and water in a way that seemed almost musical. Ewan felt a sense of connection he had never known before. He had given life to something thought dead, and in return the ship had given him a feeling of triumph, of wonder, of pure awe. For hours, Ewan worked, keeping the engine running, adjusting valves, and making minor repairs. He could feel the ship settling into her rhythm, her heartbeat growing stronger with every rotation of the pistons. The boiler hissed steadily, the gears moved in perfect harmony, and the metal walls hummed with energy. The ship was alive, not just in machinery, but in spirit. News of his progress had already begun to spread. Reporters and local historians gathered at a safe distance, cameras ready, phones out, watching the steam rise from the smokestacks. Some brought experts, engineers who offered advice, tools, and encouragement. Ewan welcomed their help cautiously, knowing that too many hands could disrupt the delicate balance. Still, seeing others inspired by the ship's revival made the achievement even more meaningful. By evening, the ship was fully responsive. Ewan had achieved what many thought impossible. She was not ready to sail across oceans, but she could move under her own power, and that was enough for now. The sight of the massive pistons working in rhythm, the boiler venting controlled clouds of steam, and the gears turning smoothly was breathtaking. It was the sound of history coming back to life, a century-long silence broken by human determination and care. Ewan leaned against the railing, breathing heavily but smiling. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a warm glow across the harbor. Steam rose into the sky, blending with clouds, as if marking the rebirth of the Iron Widow. He felt a sense of completion, but also a quiet anticipation. This was just the beginning. The ship had awakened, and now she had a story to tell once more. He thought about the generations who had worked on her, sailed her, and maintained her. They would never know that she would move again, but he felt their presence in every turn of the engine, every hiss of steam, every vibration in the metal. The ship was a bridge between the past and present, a living monument to human skill, patience, and resilience. As night fell, the harbor quieted, but the ship continued to hum with life. Ewan made his final checks for the day, ensuring the engine remained stable, the pressure steady, and the machinery safe. He stepped back, letting the ship rest in her own rhythm. Outside, the city lights reflected on the water, shimmering like stars, and for the first time in over a century, the Iron Widow was not abandoned. Ewan knew that more work awaited him, repairs, maintenance, and careful planning for the future, but he had crossed the most difficult threshold. The ship had responded, and nothing could take that moment away. He had brought life back to something long thought lost, proving that patience, knowledge, and love for what others ignore could achieve the extraordinary. And as he stood there, watching steam rise from the smokestacks, he felt something extraordinary himself, a quiet, deep satisfaction that only comes from reviving something the world thought was gone forever. The ship was alive, and so was the dream. After the engine had roared back to life, Ewan McLeary felt a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and awe. The ship he had worked on for months, the Iron Widow, was no longer just a relic of the past. She was alive, her machinery responding perfectly to his careful touch. Steam hissed from the boilers, pistons moved rhythmically, and the massive gears rotated with a steady pulse. But Ewan knew that the ship's journey was far from over. Restarting the engine was only the beginning. Now came the challenge of preserving her for the future and sharing her story with the world. The local authorities, who had long ignored the abandoned vessel, finally took notice. Officials visited the harbor, cautiously inspecting the ship and Ewan's work. They were surprised and impressed, some openly admitting they had doubted that the engines could ever turn again. Maritime preservationists also arrived, bringing their expertise and advice on how to stabilize the structure. Ewan welcomed them, knowing that collaboration was essential for keeping the ship safe. Together, they discussed ways to repair weakened sections, protect the wood from rot, and reinforce the hull without losing the authenticity of her original design. News of the ship's revival spread quickly through the city and then across the country. Reporters, photographers, and television crews arrived, eager to document the remarkable achievement. Crowds gathered along the harbor, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the massive vessel as steam poured from her smokestacks. People who had walked past the abandoned ship for decades now stopped in awe. Many could not believe that the Iron Widow, silent for 117 years, could move under her own power. Children pressed their faces against the railings of nearby docks, eyes wide with wonder, while older visitors shared memories of hearing stories about the ship when they were young. Ewan remained humble. He avoided interviews at first, preferring to focus on the ship and her care. For him, this was not about fame or recognition. It was about honoring the vessel's history and ensuring that she could be preserved for future generations. He spent long hours on the deck, inspecting the machinery, taking notes, and making small adjustments. Even when surrounded by attention and cameras, he treated the ship with the same patience and respect he had shown from the very first day he stepped aboard. The revival of the ship inspired others in unexpected ways. Students from local schools came to study her, learning about early 20th century engineering, maritime history, and the dedication it took to restore such a complex machine. Workshops were organized, where children could touch tools, see how steam engines worked, and understand the careful balance between technology and care. Local artisans contributed, creating displays, protective coverings, and models to help visitors visualize the ship's original design. The Iron Widow became more than a ship. She became a classroom, a museum, and a symbol of human creativity and persistence. Ewan also used the opportunity to educate the public about maritime heritage. He explained how ships like the Iron Widow were once essential to trade, transportation, and communication across the world. He told stories about sailors, engineers, and dockworkers, emphasizing that every rivet and gear had a human touch. People were captivated. They listened not only to the story of the ship's revival, but also to the stories of those who had worked on her a century ago. The Iron Widow became a bridge between generations, connecting past and present in a way that few monuments could achieve. Over time, the ship was officially recognized as a protected heritage vessel. Funding was secured to maintain her structure, repair weakened areas, and provide guided tour. Ewan worked closely with preservationists to ensure that every repair respected the original design. Modern technology was used sparingly, only where necessary for safety, while the heart of the ship, the engine he had restarted, remained authentic. Visitors could watch demonstrations of the engine, feeling the vibrations through the deck and hearing the rhythmic hiss of steam. It was a living history lesson, a rare opportunity to experience a machine from the early 1900s in motion. The first public demonstration was a moment Ewan would never forget. People lined the docks, cameras ready, as he carefully started the engine. The pistons moved, the gears turned, and steam vented from the boiler in controlled bursts. Gasps of excitement and applause filled the air. Children laughed and pointed, adults smiled, and some quietly wiped tears from their eyes. For many, it was more than a technical achievement. It was proof that dedication and love for history could bring something thought lost back to life. As the ship settled into her rhythm, Ewan walked the deck, feeling the vibrations under his feet. He remembered the countless hours he had spent cleaning, oiling, and adjusting every component. He remembered the frustration of frozen valves, the challenge of corroded metal, and the thrill of each small victory. And now, seeing the ship respond to his efforts, he felt an overwhelming sense of connection. This was more than a mechanical triumph. It was a partnership between human patience and the enduring spirit of history. Visitors were often surprised by the scale and complexity of the ship's machinery. Ewan explained how each piston worked, how steam powered the engine, and how the valves regulated pressure. People listened with fascination, many realizing for the first time the skill and ingenuity required to operate such a vessel. For Ewan, teaching others was just as rewarding as the restoration itself. He loved seeing their eyes light up with curiosity, knowing that the Iron Widow was inspiring a new generation to appreciate the wonders of engineering and history. The revival also sparked a broader interest in maritime preservation. Other abandoned vessels in nearby harbors were surveyed, with plans to restore or protect them. Communities began to value the industrial heritage that had long been ignored. The Iron Widow became a symbol, showing that even machines thought lost could be brought back to life with patience, knowledge, and care. Ewan's work demonstrated that history was not static. It could be experienced, touched, and appreciated in the present. Even as the ship became a public attraction, Ewan remained deeply personal in his approach. He often spent quiet evenings alone on the deck, watching the water shimmer under the moonlight. The city was silent, and the only sounds were the gentle hiss of steam and the occasional call of a distant gull. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from a curious child in his grandfather's workshop to a mechanic who had restored a piece of history thought lost forever. It was a moment of quiet triumph, one that needed no applause because it belonged to the ship and to him alone. Ewan also considered the people who had worked on the ship long ago. He imagined their lives, their routines, and the pride they must have felt seeing the vessel move through the oceans. Though they were gone, their craftsmanship endured, speaking to a time when human skill and labor shaped incredible machines. In bringing the ship back to life, Ewan felt a connection not only to the vessel, but also to the generations of workers who had built, maintained, and sailed her. It was as if he had reunited the past with the present in the most literal way possible. Over the following months, the ship became a center of learning and inspiration. School groups, tourists, and history enthusiasts visited regularly. Ewan organized guided tour, explaining every detail of the restoration process. He showed how the engines had been carefully restarted, demonstrating the careful balance between preservation and operation. People could feel the vibrations under their feet, hear the hiss of steam, and watch massive pistons move as they had more than a century ago. It was an unforgettable experience, and for many, it was a reminder of the power of persistence and dedication. The ship also inspired artists, writers, and photographers. They captured her in paintings, stories, and photographs, portraying her as a monument to resilience. Exhibitions were held in the city's museums, highlighting the restoration process and celebrating the achievement of reviving a vessel abandoned for 117 years. The Iron Widow became more than a ship. She became a symbol of hope, showing that even things forgotten could be reborn. Ewan continued to care for the ship daily. Maintenance was ongoing, requiring attention to detail and a deep understanding of the machinery. He worked closely with preservationists to ensure that all repairs honored the original design. Despite the fame, he remained focused on the work itself, knowing that every adjustment mattered. The ship had been given a second chance at life, and it was his responsibility to ensure she remained safe, functional, and true to her history. Through it all, Ewan never lost sight of the lesson the ship had taught him. Patience, respect, and dedication could achieve the extraordinary. By listening carefully, studying thoroughly, and acting with care, he had restored not just a machine, but a piece of history. The Iron Widow had not only returned to life, she had also inspired countless people to see the value in what others might consider forgotten or impossible. As the sun set over the harbor, casting golden reflections on the water, Ewan stood on the deck, looking out at the city. Steam rose from the smokestacks, curling into the evening sky. The ship hummed gently beneath his feet, a soft but steady reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. He smiled, knowing that the Iron Widow would continue to inspire, educate, and captivate people for generations to come. And in that moment, he realized that the work, patience, and love he had poured into the ship were more than a restoration. They were a bridge between the past and the future, a living testament to human curiosity, skill, and care. The story of the ship, abandoned for 117 years, had finally found its voice again. And it spoke not only of engines and boilers, of rust and steel, but of perseverance, dedication, and the extraordinary potential in seeing what others overlook. The Iron Widow would sail no oceans again, perhaps, but she had become eternal in her new life. As a symbol, a museum, and a lesson that sometimes, history only waits for someone patient enough to listen and brave enough to act.